Hello and welcome to the Anishinaabe History Podcast. I'm Chris Waite. John Deere developed tractor implements back in the 1830s. What was happening in those days across Turtle Island that allowed John Deere the opportunity to develop his tractors? If you go to the John Deere Company website, you can learn that he was a blacksmith who moved from Vermont to Illinois around 1836. His insight was to use a broken steel saw blade as part of a farming plow. The soil was different in Illinois, so iron and wood often got stuck. Steel didn't get stuck in the soil, so plowing became easier. Farmers could be more productive, and John Deere made money and started his company, which is still around today, nearly 200 years later. But how did those farmers and blacksmiths come to be on the land that was formerly inhabited by indigenous peoples? If we look at the years before 1836, we can see how the way was paved for Indian removal prior to John Deere's adaptation of the plow. The Anglo-American Convention convened in 1818. This convention was actually the treaty between Britain and the United States to establish the 49th parallel as the border between British North America and the United States. British North America is now known as Canada, and the 49th parallel remains as the international border to this day. None of the indigenous nations along that parallel had any say in the treaty, even though it would ultimately affect them, their lives, and all of the cultures along the way. The next year, the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 ceded Spanish control of Florida to the United States. According to an 1820 census, the slave population of the United States was just over 1.5 million people. Over the next 10 years, the slave population in the U.S. would be about 2 million people. In 1823, the Monroe Doctrine was declared in the United States. The Monroe Doctrine declared that any European attempts to recolonize North America would be considered a hostile act against the United States. To me, this smacks of pageantry and the construction of a false narrative for political purposes because the Anglo-American Convention was signed just 5 years prior in 1818. Plus, the Spanish had recently ceded Florida. The vitriolic, rabble-rousing, aggressive, expansionist rhetoric of American politics has been with us for 200 years. Beethoven's Symphony No. 9 was first performed in Vienna in 1824. What were the politics like in the 1820s and 1830s on Turtle Island? I've already mentioned the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. What other legislation existed in the 1820s that was focused against indigenous peoples? On the northern side of the Medicine Line, which was created in 1818 by the British and the Americans via the Anglo-American Convention, many treaties were signed in what was then called Upper Canada, between the British and the indigenous people on the northern shores of the Great Lakes. Quote, "The Upper Canada Land Surrenders, sometimes known as the Upper Canada Treaties, is a title given to a series of agreements made between indigenous peoples and the Crown. These agreements were made during the late 18th century and into the 19th century, before Confederation and the creation of the province of Ontario. The agreements surrendered indigenous lands to the colonial government for a variety of purposes, including settlement and development. The Upper Canada land surrenders cover much of what is now southwestern Ontario." End quote. That's according to the Canadian Encyclopedia. It also states the following, quote, The total number of Upper Canada land surrenders differs depending on the source, but most agree that there are 30 to 40. The following list accounts for only those land surrenders not associated with other treaties in Toronto, such as some of the numbered treaties, the Williams treaties, and the Robinson treaties." End quote. Some of the so-called land surrenders include the following treaties and purchases, and so on, between the years of 1814 and 1836. These are roughly the years between the death of Tecumseh and the creation of the John Deere Company. These were also roughly the same years as the so-called Family Compact that was in control of what was then Upper Canada. The Canadian Encyclopedia states the following, quote, "The term Family Compact is an epithet, or insulting nickname. It is used to describe the network of men who dominated the legislative, bureaucratic, business, religious, and judicial centers of power in Upper Canada, present-day Ontario, from the early to mid-1800s. Members of the Family Compact had largely conservative and loyalist views. They were against democratic reform and responsible government." End quote. In 1815, the Lake Simcoe Treaty was signed. It is also known as Treaty 16. Simcoe was the last name of one of the members of the Family Compact group. Treaty 17 was signed at around the same time. A few years later, Treaty 18 was signed in 1818 and is known also as the Lake Simcoe-Nottawasaga Treaty and as the Nottawasaga Purchase. Treaties 19 and 20 were also signed in 1818. They are otherwise known as the Adjutants and Rice Lake Treaties. Treaties 21 through 25 were signed in the years 1819 to 1822. Within this same time period, the Rideau Purchase was conducted. This purchase is also known as Treaty 27, as well as Treaty 27 and a quarter. In 1827, a Huron tract of land became Treaty 29. If you're wondering, the first of the Upper Canada treaties, or land surrenders, was the Michilimackinac Treaty of 1781. South of the Medicine Line, the first Prairie du Chien Treaty was signed in 1825. In this treaty, borders between the Sioux, Sac and Fox, Menominee, Iowa, Ho-Chunk, and the Council of the Three Fires were defined. Quote, "The U.S. government invited thousands of Indian representatives from all of the affected tribes in the upper Mississippi region to come gather at Prairie du Chien during August 1825. Territorial governors William Clark of Missouri and Lewis Cass of Michigan facilitated discussions. The product of these talks was a general treaty of peace among all of the tribes in attendance, which established boundaries between tribal nations, white settlers, and Native Americans' lands. Signed by U.S. officials and representatives of the Sioux, Ojibwe, Sauk, Fox, Meskwaki, Illinois, Menominee, Iowa, Winnebago, Ho-Chunk, Ottawa, and Potawatomi tribes. The 1825 Treaty of Prairie du Chien ultimately was created in efforts to eliminate hostilities between Native American neighboring nations until separate treaties could be negotiated with each respective tribe. For example, see a subsequent single tribe-based treaty that specifically followed as a result of this one, the 1826 Treaty of Fond du Lac. This treaty was signed in Duluth, Minnesota, with the Chippewas of Lake Superior and the Mississippi Chippewa Nations." End quote. In 1826, the United States signed a treaty at Fond du Lac with the Chippewa people living there. Fond du Lac was the French name for modern-day Duluth, Minnesota. According to Wikipedia, quote, "The first Treaty of Fond du Lac was signed by Lewis Cass and Thomas L. McKenney for the United States and representatives of the Ojibwe of Lake Superior and the Mississippi on August 5, 1826, proclaimed on February 7, 1827, and codified in the United States statutes at large as 7 Stat 290. The Ojibwe chiefs who were not in attendance to the first Treaty of Prairie du Chien agreed to its adhesion. The Ojibwe nations granted to the United States the rights to minerals exploration and mining within Ojibwe lands located north of the Prairie du Chien line. Provisions were also made for the Ojibwe living about St. Mary's River. As addenda to this treaty, arrest warrants to certain individuals living outside the jurisdiction of the United States were issued and land grants to the Métis were made. End quote. The two treaties of 1825 and 1826 between the Ojibwe and the United States not only set the stage for later American politics concerning Native people, but it also set the stage for Canadian politics concerning Native people. Without the earlier treaties of the 1820s between Southern Ojibwe and the United States, there would not have been later treaties between Northern Ojibwe and Britain in the 1850s. And without the treaties between Britain and the Northern Anishinaabe nations along the Great Lakes, the prairies, and boreal forest, Canada would not exist as a country. It is true that Ojibwe people signed treaties with French, British, American, and then Canadian nations. But it should be remembered and understood that we signed all of the treaties as Ojibways. That's why we have things like Indian status cards and Indian reservations and the Indian Removal Act and also the Indian Act. It all goes back to these early treaties, before the Robinson Treaties of 1850 and long before the numbered treaties of the country of Canada. Ojibwe people across Turtle Island signed treaties with other nations because the Ojibwe already had a system of government before there was ever European contact. As America grew, it signed treaties with nations that formerly had been allies of the British. The Ojibwe are an example. But because no nation is truly homogeneous, the alliances with outside groups opened rifts within groups. For instance, in 1829, Chief Keokuk left his home of Saganak, vowing to never return. Keokuk was a contemporary and rival of Chief Blackhawk. The influx of Euro-American immigrants was too much for Keokuk. He didn't want to fight, so he agreed to leave. Blackhawk, however, didn't want to leave. His resistance led to what is now known as Blackhawk's War. The second and third Prairie du Chien treaties were signed in 1829. These were so-called land cession treaties between the Council of Three Fires, the Ho-Chunk, and the United States. The United States wanted the Indian tribes to be at peace so that the land could be purchased more easily. It would be a mistake to think that the indigenous people of the 1820s and 1830s were all backward savages lacking mental sophistication, culture, and localized governance. The Cherokee, for example, were amongst the so-called 5 civilized tribes in the southeast region of what is now the United States of America. Quote, except for the earthen mounds built by their Mississippian progenitors, enormous fields were the most visually impressive feature of the southeastern Indian life. Farming in the southeast probably began about 3000 BCE, when women, who were the gatherers of wild foods, began to cultivate some of the plants that they collected. Soon they began to grow squash. By CE 300, they were planting corn, and about CE 1000, beans appeared on the scene. Cherokees were a part of this agricultural revolution in the southeast. Although they speak an Iroquoian language that is very different from the Muskogean and Siouan languages spoken by most of their neighbors in the southeast, linguists think that the Cherokees split off from northern Iroquois people at least 3,500 years ago. By the time Europeans arrived, Cherokees had been in the region for a very long time and participated fully in the agricultural economy that had given rise to the Mississippian cultural tradition. This culture emerged about CE 800 in the Mississippi Valley, and by 1000 it had reached the ancestors of the Cherokees. the construction of flat-top mounds, hierarchical political systems called chiefdoms, and an elaborate religious life characterized Mississippian societies. Although Cherokees no longer built mounds when Europeans arrived, their villages often included these structures, their religious beliefs had roots in Mississippian culture, and their extensive fields connected them to the Mississippian past. End quote. The Indian Removal Act of May 1830 resulted in the Trail of Tears, the name given to the westward march of thousands of people from multiple indigenous nations who were forced to move away from their homelands. Quote, the term Trail of Tears, a rough translation of the Cherokee Nuna Tuol Tsuni, describes the trek of heartbroken people to their new homes in the West. The term captures the essence of the removal experience, but also conveys the impression that removal was a uniquely Cherokee experience. Although that was not the case, there are reasons why scholars have so frequently told the story of Indian removal in Cherokee terms. One is that the debate over removal policy that occurred in the press, various public settings, and Congress focused on the Cherokees. The laws, treaties, and historical examples cited as the discussions progressed always related to the Cherokees. To many, the Cherokees demonstrated that Indians could change and that someday they could be integrated into American society. Furthermore, the Cherokee leaders during the removal crisis of the 1820s and 1830s were uniquely well-educated and extraordinarily articulate in both spoken and written English. In countless public speeches and written statements, they produced a trove of documents that dwarfs the records of other native nations. They were also masters of public relations. Their policy was to make certain that no one could forget them. The result is that the Cherokees have become the Indians whose name everyone knows, and the history of their suffering has come to represent the injustice that has characterized much of the relations between the United States and Native Americans. Only about 10% of the eastern Indians who traveled trails of tears to the place now called Oklahoma were Cherokees, however, and each of the dozens of relocated tribes has its own unique and important history. The history of the removal of the Cherokees can never substitute for the histories of the others, but it can exemplify a larger history that no one should forget. End quote. In the case of the Cherokee people, even though they were considered amongst the so-called 5 civilized tribes and were adapting and assimilating into white American culture, they were ultimately legislated to be removed from their own land. But there was legislation before the Trail of Tears that basically had the same effect. The Americans and the British considered the so-called land cessions or land surrenders as legitimizing the influx and encroachment of American and Canadian settlers. Whether or not they were actually land cessions is debatable. Each treaty and purchase would have to be looked at independently and as part of the entire series of treaties. In that political climate, the only choices for Native people were to accept removal or to fight against it. But by 1828, many Native people were leaving the area to go west of the Mississippi anyway. Why? Because they were being replaced. There were many immigration policies coming from American and Canadian governments to get European settlers onto treaty land. Economically and politically, it was necessary to have like-minded people inhabiting the newly acquired region. The Encyclopedia Britannica states, for example, quote, in the mid-1820s, some southern and western states demanded that the national government take a larger role in Native American affairs. This process began in Georgia, where the governor and the state legislature tried to pressure President John Quincy Adams to remove Creek and Cherokee populations from the state. By the fall of 1827, Illinois Governor Ninian Edwards had also begun calling on the Adams administration to remove the remaining Indians from his state. Because tribes in Illinois had signed treaties ceding their land within the state decades earlier, Edwards needed only to ask the administration to enforce already existing treaties, not to negotiate new ones. In July 1828, U.S. Secretary of War Peter Porter informed Edwards that the remaining Native Americans had agreed to leave the state by the end of May 1829. End quote. In addition, there were experimental colonies and incentives such as free land for people willing to move deeper into what was formerly Indian country. And if any Indians disagreed, then they would be met with swift and unrelenting justice in the form of armed militias and punitive expeditions. The Fourth Prairie du Chien Treaty was signed in 1830. This treaty saw the Sac and Fox, Sioux, Omaha, Iowa, Oto, and Missouri cede land to the United States. But in 1832, a man named Black Hawk returned to his ancestral homeland east of the Mississippi. In the Illinois region, the Americans believed that they owned the land because of the Treaty of St. Louis, signed in 1804. Black Hawk and his people believed otherwise. His act of crossing to the east side of the Mississippi was considered as an act of aggression by the United States. That's because Captain Black Hawk had been an ally of the British during the War of 1812. Because of his affiliation, he and his people were considered as the British band. After he crossed the Mississippi, an American militia was called up and Black Hawk's so-called war began. It is interesting to note that a grandson of an American captain who fought in that war would become a billionaire who recently died, Charlie Munger. Charlie Munger died at the age of 99 years. Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett worked together for many, many decades, becoming billionaires.
I had a grandfather who was very useful to me, my mother's grandfather, and he was a pioneer, and he came out to Iowa with no money but youth and health and took it away from the Indians. He fought in the Black Hawk. He was a captain in the Black Hawk Wars, and he stayed there, and he bought cheap land, and he was aggressive and intelligent and so forth. And eventually, he was the richest man in the town and owned the bank, and highly regarded in a huge family and a very happy life.
Creosote, the chemical used to prevent wood decay in railroad ties, was developed in the 1830s. Michael Faraday discovered the electrical induction current in 1831. This discovery led to the development of electromagnetic generators. Generators create electricity in turbines that can be powered by air, steam, or water. The Battle of the Alamo occurred in February and March of 1836. This was around the time that John Deere was living in Illinois. He was a blacksmith who moved from Vermont to Opportunity. His invention was to use steel instead of iron for plows. Local farmers learned of his plow and he was able to sell the invention. The government was helping him be a farmer by providing the land and the displacement of indigenous people already living there. Quote, "When the American economic bubble burst in the 1830s, John Deere headed west, soon to be followed by his wife and 5 children. Deere was an established blacksmith back in Vermont, but he would have to start over in his new home of Illinois. Looking forward to the opportunity that comes with hard work, he began to travel west over ground he'd soon change forever." End quote. The information that is missing is that he moved to land that had been recently cleared of indigenous people via the Indian Removal Act and Black Hawk's so-called war. Thus, John Deere's opportunities came not only from a broken saw blade, a steel plow, and the local farming economy, but also from blatantly racist American legislation and acts of aggression against indigenous peoples. It should be noted that the racist legislation was enacted at a time when discoveries such as the aforementioned creosote, electric conduction, and Symphony No. 9 were also being made. To put a finer point on it, these new discoveries and wonders were to be shared amongst white people, and the brown people would have to be sent elsewhere, or die. Were indigenous people forcibly removed from Illinois before John Deere arrived around 1836? Yes. Leaders like Keokuk had to make the decision to leave. Leaders like Black Hawk decided to stay and face the consequences. But why was America able to hold so much authority over indigenous people? When did the United States of America obtain control of what is now the state of Illinois? People lived in what is now Illinois for many thousands of years prior to European contact. On Britannica.com, it states the following about Illinois history. Quote, a Paleo-Indian culture existed in southern Illinois from about 8000 BC. The Mississippian people, whose religious center was at Cahokia in southwestern Illinois, constituted probably the largest pre-Columbian, circa AD 1300, community north of Mexico in the Mississippi floodplain. Native American tribes in Illinois were all Algonquin-speaking people. In the north were the Kickapoo, Sauk, and Fox. In the Lake Michigan area were the Potawatomi, Ottawa, and Ojibwe, Chippewa. On the central prairies, the Kaskaskia and Peoria, and in the south, the Cahokia and Tamaroa. End quote. American forces captured the village known as Kaskaskia in 1778 during the Revolutionary War. The village had been a British seat of power prior to that war. The British obtained control of that region after defeating the French in 1763. The Treaty of St. Louis was signed in 1804. In 1809, about 30 years after the Americans fought for independence, Illinois Territory was formed by dividing Indiana Territory. By 1818, American settlers were moving into the eastern and western edges of southern Illinois Territory. That same year, 1818, the Illinois Constitution gave black people the status of indentured servants. This was the same year that the Anglo-American Convention was made. And it was the same year that the British signed the Lake Simcoe and Nottawasaga treaties. In 1824, Illinois voters rejected a proposal for a constitutional convention whose implicit purpose was to legalize slavery. John Deere was still living in Vermont at this time. The Upper Canada Rebellion began in 1837. This was the same year that Michigan was allowed to enter into the Union of American States. And by 1837, John Deere was in Illinois and had invented his plow adaptation. The Oregon Treaty was signed in 1846. In 1848, about 16 years after Black Hawk's War, Illinois created for itself a constitution that abolished slavery and forbade slave imports. The California Gold Rush began in 1849. Also in 1849, the Mica Bay incident occurred. It began when an illegal mining operation was set up on the northern shore of Lake Superior near present-day Sault Ste. Marie. It was illegal because no treaty had yet been signed. The company was Canadian, not Ojibwe, and it did not have permission to be there. So a group of Ojibwe and Métis men, and their lawyer, went there to cause the mining operation to cease. No one was killed in the attack. But the so-called insurgents, including Chief Shingwak and Chief Nebenagaching, were arrested by Canadian authorities. A year later, Shingwak signed a treaty with the British Crown, the Robinson-Superior Treaty of 1850. The Robinson-Superior and Robinson-Huron treaties were signed in 1850. There are still legal battles going on in Canadian courts regarding these two treaties. It is much like Black Hawk said, quote, whites were in the habit of saying one thing to the Indians and putting another thing down on paper, end quote. That's why there are huge treaty cases, such as in Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory and Treaty No. 9 territory going through the courts now worth billions of dollars. It's all because a lot of fraud had been committed by the colonizers when the treaties were signed. Each treaty was just one of many treaties that the Ojibwe signed in what are now Ontario, northern Minnesota, as well as parts of Wisconsin and Michigan. When we acknowledge one treaty, perhaps we should acknowledge them all. That's all for today's episode. Stay tuned for more episodes in the future. I'm Chris Waite, and this has been the Anishinaabe History Podcast.